Tonight, there are clear signs the Congress is edging closer to impeaching President Trump. Why? The precise answer really does matter, and it's the subject of our special report right now. Under our Constitution, you don't impeach a president based on a list of bad things they've done. You only impeach if those bad things amount to a clearly impeachable offense. And for all the evidence coming out and all the criticism of Trump, congressional Democrats, if you think about it, they have not yet outlined a focused case on what the clearest impeachable offense is. Some talk about betraying the oath or abusing power or obstruction of Congress and obstruction of justice.
The president's betrayal of his oath of office, betrayal of our national security, and betrayal of the integrity of our elections.
There are so many different things that have gone on today, very significant things that I think add up to an abuse of power by this president.
The more that they fight to try to prevent and obstruct the lawful functions of Congress, the more they're going to make a case for impeachment on obstruction of justice.
So those are several different arguments for impeachment, and historically, Congress has used more than one argument to impeach. Congress voted on 11 articles against President Johnson and 4 against President Clinton. But those presidents also bogged down in debates over all the different articles. It only takes one for the Senate to convict. And debates over which were the clearest impeachable offense. For example, for Clinton, there was a debate over whether perjury should be an impeachable high crime.
The Constitution specifically names bribery as an impeachable offense. Perjury and making false statements under oath, which is a form of perjury, be considered among the high crimes and misdemeanors the framers intended to be grounds for impeachment.
Lying about an extramarital affair, even under oath, does not rise to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors as spelled out in the Constitution.
Perjury and obstruction of justice cannot be reconciled with the office of the President of the United States.
Those were just some of the debates back and forth about things that weren't listed as impeachable in the Constitution, like perjury, and whether they were a high crime. And so for all the talk now of abuse of power or obstruction, the clearest legal case for an impeachment offense in the Ukraine scandal is one that few Democrats have been making yet. And it's staring them in the face, right in the Constitution's impeachment clause. The pivotal section of the Constitution on that is short. It says the president shall be impeached for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So if you look at that plainly, it lists just 2 specifically defined offenses. And one of them is bribery, when a government official requests or takes something of value in exchange for an action, like a politician getting a briefcase of cash, as the movie American Hustle famously showed in a depiction of the real-life abscam scandal.
Excuse me. I'll handle that for the mayor.
No, it's for the mayor. It'd be a sign of disrespect to the sheik if the mayor didn't take it. It's for you, Mayor.
What are you doing? Carl, what is this?
I'm gonna take care of it. Everything's good. I got everything under control.
Whoa. Hey. What is this? I'm gonna handle this. What is this? I don't know.
I don't know you. I don't know what that is, but it's weird. You understand?
What is this? Well, a briefcase of cash is, of course, the bribe. And the politician can say they'll do something in return for it, which is why bribes are often referred to as quid pro quo, which is just a Latin legal term that means thing for thing. And that's why legal experts say there's already such a strong amount of evidence that Trump demanded a bribe from Ukraine in exchange for Trump releasing money to Ukraine or for a meeting with the president of Ukraine. That would be the action in return. So here is the simple case. Trump wants the Biden probe, the favor, that's the valuable bribe, corruptly demanded by the official. And as that definition of bribery says, that's directly demanding something of value. And unlike some harder cases, here, Trump's already admitted his goal.
I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer.
Very simple. And now Trump's own Ukraine ambassador, Mr. Taylor, testifying about that same action sought in return, releasing money to Ukraine, contingent on the Biden probe. And not only that, remember, an official can actually be guilty of bribery by merely agreeing to do something. That is enough. They don't have to actually do it. So if you pledge a quid pro quo and you don't even follow through, you're still on the hook. The Supreme Court ruled that unanimously in a recent case. So unlike those debates over a high crime or what's an abuse of power and what do those terms mean, now, with this evidence, the case for bribery is straightforward. And everyone knows bribery is impeachable because the Constitution says it is. Now, I want to be clear as we report this out for you tonight. President Trump still has defenses to this kind of case, which he and his lawyers will continue to make. One is that, well, even if the Biden probe would benefit Donald Trump's reelection, he can argue he generally thought it was in the U.S. interest and not a bribe. And Trump has been insisting he had that kind of duty to fight corruption.
I have an obligation to do it, probably a duty to do it. Corruption. We are looking for corruption.
Another defense is about the presidency itself, not whatever one thinks of Donald Trump. It's the argument that even if the Ukraine plot was a terrible, unethical, no good scheme that should have been stopped, the argument is that Congress should not set a precedent that a president can be removed for what his defenders basically say is verbal hardball in foreign policy. And the U.S. has an interest in supporting a strong president in these foreign negotiations, not worrying that a single phone call might become impeachable. But you know what? And you might be thinking of this already. There is a problem with those defenses, and it's that they, even as defenses, admit the actions at the heart of Donald Trump's Ukraine scandal. And then they sort of argue that impeachment is just too strong a punishment, which isn't the greatest defense. Now, there are a few other options in a White House. There aren't many other options in a White House where you have scenes like this. Mick Mulvaney walks out, basically admits what could be crimes on live TV before trying to take it all back.
Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money. The look back to what happened in 2016 certainly was part of the thing that he was worried about in corruption with that nation. And that is absolutely appropriate.
Withholding the funding.
Yeah.
What you just described is a quid pro quo.
We do that all the time with foreign policy.
What exactly did you hope Zelensky would do about the Bidens after your phone call?
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer.
What do you do with all that evidence? Well, we just asked the prosecutor who actually ran the SDNY office. That's the same office run by Preet Bharara and Rudy Giuliani, which is, of course, now investigating Giuliani. And he said something interesting that I want to show you. He said, given all this testimony from Trump to Mulvaney to Ambassador Taylor, normally this kind of case wouldn't even go to trial.
I doubt that this is a case that would really go to trial. When confronted with all the evidence, a reasonable defendant would likely take a plea.
You're saying someone presented with this evidence, like
it's pretty damning evidence.
Damning evidence for a plea instead of a trial. But there's no pleading out for a president when it comes to impeachment. You either resign, like Nixon did, or you stay and fight, like Johnson and Clinton. Now, if the House does impeach, the Senate is preparing to hear all that evidence at a trial.
What does happen in the Senate if the House does get through with this inquiry and decide that they are going to impeach President Trump?
Well, under the Senate rules, we're required to take it up if the House does go down that path, and we'll follow the Senate rules.
The rules require the Senate to take up this trial if the House impeaches. And this brings us back to what they impeach on, because impeaching specifically for bribery would focus on lots of the evidence that could make Trump look guilty. To cite another former defendant who confessed to questionable acts before an indictment, Rick Ross once said, federal sentences, let's go to trial. We're guilty till proven innocent. Ross was defiantly welcoming a trial that he felt was stacked against him. And Donald Trump has long complained about a rigged system. But most of the rigging has been for Donald Trump and in his direction, which is why on this evidence, most other people would have pled guilty by now, as that prosecutor told us. So when it comes to a defiant defendant, it may be worth ensuring for the Congress that the case is as specific and airtight as possible. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.